just listening to one of my favorite podcasts called Hidden Brain, and they had a psychologist on named Emily Pronin, and it was a really good podcast. It was titled The Double Standard, and it was all about how, putting it in my words a little bit, how inconsistent we are when we assess other people's views or beliefs or what they do or how they form an opinion, etc., compared to how we evaluate our own. And it talked a lot about the science and some research around that, and kind of what lies underneath that. And it was a lot about biases and blind spots, etc., and a lot of really useful information. Learned a bunch from it. Thought it was a really, really good podcast. But one of the things I'm trying to do is, in true Richard Feynman kind of spirit, is take things like that seem great and dig more, right? Get underneath them more, try and really understand them at a deeper, almost first principles level, and really pressure test things more, try and validate it. And the genesis for that, or the motivation for that, isn't because I think it's bad or wrong. It's in the spirit of learning, and it's in the spirit of the only way we really learn, the only way we really know, is if we test things and we look, and it's from a curiosity place, right? Because if what's being said is true, and there's really great insights there, then awesome. Like, I want to know it, everybody should know it. If it's slightly off or there's things that can be improved upon, also awesome, right? Let's get to the objective should be truth. So in the spirit of that, I know it was an hour-long podcast, so I won't go through the whole thing. But one of the key, I guess, thesis of the podcast was the idea that our own introspection is not reliable. Because much like we would talk about in these videos, a lot of it happens in the subconscious. A lot of it we're not aware of, our biases, those types of things. We believe the narrative we tell ourselves or the subconscious tells us, so we're not really fully aware of that. So that was kind of a key component. And then kind of the action or the to-do from that, because he asked the question at the end, which was, what would you tell the country, America, coming off of this, bitter presidential campaign and election, how do we come back together? And her advice was, don't, the same way you assume your own views and beliefs come from a good place and you have good intentions and they're thoughtful and, there's a lot that goes into it, assume the same about everybody else. Try and be consistent about how you evaluate. So those two things made me think. The things I'd want to pressure test, the things I'd want to kind of, it sounds too aggressive of a term, but like rip apart and really, let's get under the covers. Let's look at the wiring. Let's understand it. If I was talking to Emily, would be two things related to those 2 points. One, on the introspection point, I totally get that. I totally get that logic, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. What I wonder is, because one of the things that I've found and tried to build upon is, what would she say to the idea of like using this mathematical type logic to assess our own thinking? Because as I've talked about before, right, this whole idea of this game we're playing with the subconscious is trying to tell us a story. It's trying to protect us ultimately, but it's spinning a narrative that it wants us to believe, and it's difficult for us to know the truth. And the thing you need to do is kind of to checkmate the subconscious. You need to take like a checkmate line of questioning, which is mathematically logical in its approach, so that as you start to evaluate your own views and beliefs, you don't rely on your gut feel, you don't rely on your intuition, you don't rely on your feelings and your emotions, you don't even rely on the first thoughts that pop into your head or anything like that. You have to put it through that rigor. You have to put it through that mathematically logical rigor and say, do these things add up? I'm saying this, do I see that in my actions? I'm saying that, am I saying that same thing there? Are they actually the same? Right, we've talked about questions like, how would I know if I was wrong? What would it look like? Am I entertaining the possibility that I'm wrong? All the tools we talk about, can that help with that? Because it seemed a little bit like it was a blanket statement, like introspection is just never reliable. We can't use that. You need to find some other yardstick to measure. And I'd want to understand that better, because I think, but I'd love it if she could help prove me wrong, that no, actually that mathematically logical thinking, it's still too dependent on your own mind and your own subconscious. Therefore, you can never use that as an effective tool. And that may be true. And if so, again, I'd love to know that. The other piece I would push on and pressure test a little bit is the advice she gave at the end, right? Be consistent. And I'll relate it to, they talked earlier in the podcast of, like how do you help people that are in this case? And there wasn't a lot to it, right? It was like you make them aware of it, and it kind of fizzled out from there, which I get, right? This is where I would come in and say, I've talked about this before, like there's kind of the two teams you have working for yourself, right? There's the strategy team, which does that mathematical thinking, which tries to do that deep analysis and understand it and get to as close as we can to objective truth. But once you've done that analysis and you've come to a stopping point, it gets kicked over to kind of the quote unquote execution team or the operations team, who actually needs to go do the work. And that's really all about mental toughness. And I think that's the part that maybe wasn't touched upon enough in this podcast or wasn't addressed enough. And I'd love to hear the take on that, because the idea of giving the advice to the country of, assume other people have good intentions as well and they're being thoughtful, try and be consistent as you analyze, that all makes good sense, right? I would argue it's probably mathematically logical if you break it down and look at it. But the problem isn't in that. Right? The problem is once you come to an inconvenient truth, something that you didn't want to believe, and okay, maybe Democrats or Republicans or whatever aren't evil or aren't stupid. That's one thing to come to that realization. How do you actually change your behavior? How do you actually implement that and execute that and use it when you're running your analysis or thinking about things or evaluating somebody day to day? That's really, really hard. That takes a ton of hard work. It takes a ton of mental toughness. It takes a ton of humility, empathy, takes all those types of things, takes a level of grit and just grinding through it and pushing, a tolerance for discomfort, because it is going to be uncomfortable. And that's the piece that I would say when talking about this topic, at least in this podcast, didn't come up maybe enough. And I'd love to get the take on it. I'd love to hear if she thinks there's something to that or if there's some other way to do it. So I use this as one, just kind of very, very high level, summarize a couple key points from this podcast, but two, it's a little bit of an indication or a teaser, if you will, of what I'd like to do with people that have great research and great opinions and views on a topic, people who have a philosophy on life, have a way of looking at things that they think is either will be really useful to somebody or it really works, right? Whatever it is, great. I hope it does. Let's test it. Let's look. Let's rip that thing apart. Let's look under the covers. Let's look at the wiring. Let's see if it really works. And from a Richard Feynman curiosity perspective, let's see what we can find.